Good morning. The title of the sermon is, If Seeing is Believing, How Do We See? I'm going to read from the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, verses 21 through 28. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an unclean spirit cried out, "What do you want with me, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The unclean spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority? He even gives orders to unclean spirits, and they obey him." News about Jesus spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. This ends the reading of the word. This is the first healing story in the Gospel of Mark. It takes place just 21 verses into the Gospel. Jesus had just started preaching, and the story takes place immediately after he calls his first disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John. Jesus is largely unknown. It says that Jesus goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, which probably would make this the main worship service for the week. And there is this man there that would be described today as being mentally ill, most likely having multiple personalities. From the reaction of the people to the man, no great shock at his presence, it seems like he was regularly in the synagogue. There's a wonderful tradition within Judaism of giving alms to persons in need, like this man. So it would not be surprising for this man to hang around the synagogue, especially for worship on the Sabbath. That's when he might get a little bit of help. So Jesus does some teaching and preaching, probably with this man sitting there. And it says people were amazed, seeing in Jesus an authority, something that was more than a typical rabbi in the way he taught. However, in response to Jesus' teaching and preaching, the mentally ill man comes forth with the highest affirmation that has yet been bestowed upon Jesus in the entire Gospels up to that point. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, there is a clear absence of lofty terms placed upon Jesus until toward the end of the Gospel. For the most part, people didn't really know who he was. But right here at the outset, this mentally ill person identifies Jesus as the Holy One of God. Not a Holy One of God, but the Holy One of God. In essence, this man is identifying Jesus as the Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word. Christ would be the Greek word. Jesus, you are the Messiah. Jesus, you are the Christ, is what he says, in essence. Now, in this story, these multiple personalities that seem to come forth, at least one or more of them seems to feel that they are threatened by Jesus. And in some ways they are. Jesus responds by healing the man, or in the context of the day, casting out the unclean spirits that had a grip on him. And the people are even more amazed, which is further indication that this man was not new to the synagogue. What I want to focus on is this. The first person to identify Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, is a person who is deeply, deeply marginalized, literally pushed to the edge of society because of his mental illness. He was an object of pity. He would have been the last person anyone would look to speak the truth. Yet this is the first person in the Gospel of Mark to identify Jesus as the Holy One of God, the Messiah, the Christ. Hold on to that thought which we will return to momentarily. Our call to worship describes our human condition. Now we see in a mirror dimly. Now we know in part. These words from 1 Corinthians 13 suggest that our seeing is very limited, almost like we have blinders on, or as if we are forced to look at the world through a paper towel roll. If you can kind of imagine look through a paper towel roll, seeing just, a small part, a fraction of all that there is to see. I want to focus on seeing. Again, I remind you of the title of the sermon. If seeing is believing, how do we see? This is the season of Epiphany. Epiphanies are moments in which we see beyond the narrow confines of a paper towel roll, when the normal dimness is replaced by clarity in our ability to see. The truth is, scientifically, we don't see anything directly. Seeing by definition is indirect. Light bounces off an object and enters our eye, where the light moves through the cornea to the retina on the back of our eye. The retina is made up of rod and cone-shaped cells. The rod-shaped cells function mainly in dim light and provide mostly black and white vision, telling information whether it is dark or light. The cone-shaped cells, which function best in bright light, allow us to perceive color. So this reflected light that enters the eye gets broken down into different sorts of information by the rods and cones, and this information is then sent through the optic nerve to the brain. This information is then processed by the brain and becomes our awareness, our consciousness, our seeing. However, we generally only are able to see what is within pre-established or pre-learned or pre-taught boundaries or expectations. This is why the native peoples couldn't see the ships of Christopher Columbus on the horizon approaching, because they had not pre-established expectations of anything like a sailing ship. So when the Apostle Paul, who's really into epiphanies, by the way, says, now we see in a mirror dimly, he is talking about normal, non-epiphanal seeing. A seeing like us looking through a paper towel roll. A very limited, impartial seeing, a small slice or a dim reflection of a much, much larger and much, much grander ultimate reality. In 1983, when I was 23 years old, 1 year out of college, I remember watching a segment of 60 Minutes one Sunday night that radically changed my understanding of seeing. In a roughly 15-minute segment, Morley Safer introduced Leslie Lemke to the world. Leslie Lemke was a boy born in 1952, severely disabled emotionally and physically. His IQ as an adult would be calculated at 58, meaning that he would function at about the level of a second grader. However, on top of that, Leslie Lemke had severe physical disabilities, and in particular being completely blind. His birth mother gave him up for adoption because she knew that she could not care for him. However, the doctor said that he would probably die before he was 5 and that he should not be eligible for adoption. Yet his adoption at the age of 6 months happened despite the doctor's recommendations, because the adoptive parents saw Leslie as a gift from God. The adoptive parents, May and Joseph Lemke, were in their early 50s, both persons of deep Christian faith. They had 5 adult children when they adopted Leslie. May was tiny, just 4 feet 8 inches, but she is a powerhouse. She was a nurse, and she would be Leslie's primary caregiver, and love and care for him she did. She would carry this tiny blind infant with her. He could not swallow, so May would push food down his throat to keep him alive. She would talk with him, although he could not talk back. She would strap him to her back with her behind him and sort of drag him along to teach him how to walk. Yet he would not stand until he was 12, and he could not walk until he was 15. May and Joseph purchased a used piano for Leslie when he was 7 and put it in his bedroom. He seemed to like music, and he would bang on the keys. Although he couldn't talk, he could hear. The banging away on the piano continued for a number of years, but they didn't think much about it. But by the age of 12, Leslie started making music on the piano, and it brought him great joy. It didn't sound that bad either. One night in 1966, when Leslie was 14, May and Joseph and Leslie had watched, well, Leslie just listened, to Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 performed on TV, a complex piece that only an accomplished pianist can play. At 3 a.m, May and Joseph awoke to the sound of that same Piano Concerto No. 1 by Tchaikovsky. How could Leslie have gotten down and possibly turned on the TV? He didn't even know how. And how could the same show be playing? It didn't make sense. However, then they noticed that the piano music was coming from Leslie's room. Opening the door, they saw Leslie playing the piece. Leslie was blind, completely self-taught, playing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 perfectly and precisely, identical to the way it was played on TV. Here's a picture of that day when that happened in 1966. From that point, Leslie's music caused him to bloom. Through his music, he began to sing and then to talk. Yes, he could sing before he could talk. Leslie began playing all styles of music from ragtime to classical. Like the Tchaikovsky piece, he only has to hear the music once in order to play it again perfectly. By 1980, Leslie was regularly giving concerts throughout Wisconsin. He was featured on 60 Minutes in 1983, the show I watched. He went on to be featured on the CBS Evening News, and later that year, the TV movie called The Woman Who Willed a Miracle told the story of Leslie, May, and Joseph Lemke, starring Cloris Leachman as May. Through the 1990s and 2000s, he performed concerts throughout the United States, Europe, and Japan. Here he is playing at one of those concerts. Actually, this is from 2007. In 2014, Daryl Treffert, one of the leading researchers in the world on savants, people like Leslie, wrote a powerful article on Leslie Lemke for Scientific American magazine. He writes this in that article: Leslie has a measured verbal IQ of 58. He says, I have a TV clip of him, of one of his concerts in which Leslie was asked to play a piece he had never heard before. The brand new piece was played for Leslie, and he paused for 3 seconds, processing what he just heard, and then played simultaneously, perhaps a tenth of a second delayed, behind the pianist he was listening to. Leslie was parallel processing, just as some incredibly gifted translators are able to do, translating as the speaker speaks rather than pausing. You can go online and you can buy a DVD. Leslie Lemke live in Pittsville. Along with the sermon-only link, I've included a few other links about Leslie Lemke. Pretty amazing stuff. As I mentioned, I saw that original 60 Minutes segment on Leslie, May, and Joseph Lemke. I'd like you to jump ahead 7 years. 7 years later, 1983, I watched that on Leslie Lemke, and then in 1990, I was in the beginning the third year of my very first appointment, serving two small country churches. And, after a couple of years, people kind of get to know you a little bit. Well, one of the women in the church was pretty active. About 2 years in, she asked me one day if I'd be willing to come to her home and meet her husband. And I said, well, of course. And she said, well, there's a little more to that. She said, and I'll call him Robert, that's not his real name. She said, Robert, he had severe PTSD, and he cannot go outside. He has all sorts of fears, and he's really immobilized by his fear, and he really can't have contact with just about anyone outside of myself and just a couple of family members. But over time, I've shared a little bit about you, and I think you two might actually hit it off, and I think it would be good for him. And so I prepared, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what what am I going to say? What am I going to do? And what if I say the wrong thing? And I really worried about it and stressed about it. I did some research on it with PTSD, and finally the day came, and we got together. And Robert was amazingly bright. You just tell that right away. And while I was real careful about my words, gradually over time, we got to know each other. And so we started meeting about every other month. And over time, different things began to be shared. It was probably about a year into that we were sitting and talking one time, and I didn't even know exactly how it came around, but somehow drawing came up. And he said, I've done quite a bit of drawing. I said, oh yeah. I said, what type of drawing? He said, well, pen and ink. I remember saying, pen and ink, wow, that's pretty unforgiving, right? You make a mistake and, it's a problem. And then he turned, and just behind him there was a picture, actually I had seen before, a picture of Geronimo on the wall. And I said, I've seen that picture before. He said, it's a picture of Geronimo. And I said, yeah, that's an amazing photograph. And then Robert said, it's not a photograph. I said, what? I said, are you serious? That's your pen and ink? He said, yeah. Well, he got it down and he put it down in front of me. And I looked at it, and it was indeed a pen and ink. I mean, it was almost like a computer pixel, done perfectly. I mean, with each little line, and literally hundreds of thousands of little tiny little marks of his pen. But it gets better. I said, so how did you do this? Did you have the picture and then see it and right next to you as you drew it with pen and ink? He said, no. He said, actually, I saw it in a museum. And it was about 2 years later, I decided to draw it. And then it got a little better. I said, are you serious? You had it in your memory? He said, yeah. He says, that's kind of the way I work. That's kind of the way I see. And then it got a little better because he described how he did that picture. He said, what I do is I start with a blank sheet of paper, and I start at the top, and I go across line by line, and I make my marks, and I move down the sheet, and when I get to the bottom, I'm done. It was then that chills ran down my spine. I felt like morally safer meeting Leslie Lemke 7 years earlier. Leslie Lemke was blind. However, Leslie Lemke saw music not through the narrow confines of a paper towel roll, but 360 degrees in slow motion, seeing every note, every chord, every nuance of that note or chord. Robert has severe PTSD. He is profoundly agoraphobic. He is deeply incapacitated. Yet Robert sees on a level that is far, far beyond any other person that I have ever met in my life. Seeing. In the gospel passage, the man with the unclean spirit in the synagogue was profoundly disabled in a number of different ways. He lived on the margins of society. He was an object of pity, a basket case. And yet he saw more profoundly than even Jesus' own disciples, who left everything to follow him. They were a long way from seeing Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Holy One of God. It would be a couple years before they truly saw that. But this is just one story. Yes, it happens to be the first story that Jesus is identified as the Holy One of God. Yes, it is the first healing recorded in the Gospel of Mark. But maybe Pastor Dave is reading too much into that one story about this mentally ill man who seems to see something that almost no one else could see. Maybe it's just kind of a coincidence. Well, maybe. But that same story is told in Luke in the 4th chapter. And there is another separate story about a man with an unclean spirit that identifies Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ. And that time, Jesus casts out the unclean spirits and they go into a herd of pigs and run off a cliff. That story is found in Matthew 8, Mark 5, and Luke 8. Yet these special people who could see that most people couldn't see in Jesus are not just mentally ill. One of my favorite stories is the healing of the blind beggar named Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus is blind, he's poor, he is loud, and he is obnoxious. Yet the disciples, they simply try to ignore his yells. But what does he yell? He yells, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Son of David is a messianic term. Jesus, you are the Messiah, have mercy on me, is what Bartimaeus is saying. And not only does Jesus heal Bartimaeus, he affirms his faith, his ability to see in a sense. And then it says Bartimaeus continues on as a follower of Jesus. Now there's a parallel story of the healing of Bartimaeus in the 20th chapter of Matthew. And if you carefully read the stories that precede Jesus healing a blind beggar in either the 20th chapter of Matthew or the 10th chapter of Mark, you find Jesus frustrated by his own disciples and how incredibly blind and unable to see figuratively rather than literally he was identifying them as being. They were blind, yes, and Bartimaeus was blind, but he could see. So maybe the seeing stuff is really important. Maybe the season of Epiphany, and Epiphany literally means seeing, has a deeper purpose than taking up the empty space between Christmas and leading up to Lent. Within the deep and rich tradition of Christian worship, there is a fairly well-developed concept known as liminality. Liminality has to do with limits. Liminality has to do with seeing. It works like this. When we look at something, we tend to focus on the center of our sight. I am looking right now at the camera. As I look at the camera, I think about what a camera is about. My knowledge of cameras, what do they do? Which pre-exists in my memory, my consciousness, my mind, exerts a strong influence on what I expect to see. I see a camera. Yet the light that enters my eye is not just bouncing off the camera. It is bouncing off all sorts of other things in the room. In fact, the camera constitutes only an infinitesimal fraction of the information entering my eye and moving through my retina, through the optic nerve and into my brain. But guess what? Mostly I am aware of just the camera. Why? Because everything else gets filtered out. Why? We call it intelligence. We can't possibly process the information, all the information that we see, so our brain prioritizes. And guess what? The camera's the priority. I want to do it right for the camera, right? But what if there is something else really, really important for me to see and learn about other than the camera? What if God is trying to teach me something new, something that I don't already know about, so there is nothing in my brain to prioritize it? How will I see that and learn about that? Well, it happens when I'm willing to not ignore what's on the margin. That which is not anticipated. That which I don't already know all about and pre-approve of. The power of great worship is that somehow that which is marginalized, like the man in the story, like the old beggar Bartimaeus, like blind and disabled Leslie Lemke, like my PTSD friend Robert with all of his phobias. When that which is on the margin is seen and valued and listened to and understood as the liminal source, at the limit, at the margin, the liminal source of truth and faith and God. And if you look at the definition of epiphany, you will often find another parallel term, a liminal experience. For now we see in a mirror dimly. Now we know only in part. But there will come a time when we shall see fully. That's the promise of 1 Corinthians 13. And I don't think it is only when we die. Amen.